hanged by a vengeful John Bull, ensuring that he would be numbered amongst the patriot dead. But in Britain, Casement was hanged not as an Irish rebel, but as a traitor who'd gone over to the enemy, and the enemy was Germany, not Ireland. In this context, the boat took on a different symbolic meaning. Regarded as a trophy of war, it was quickly dispatched from Kerry to England, where it was presented to George V by the Royal Irish Constabulary to mark their success in capturing the arch-traitor, Roger Casement. In turn, the King presented it to the Imperial War Museum to be included in its displays in Crystal Palace in 1920, underlining Casement's status as a traitor, not an Irish rebel. So this little boat is the vessel that propelled Casement into history as a traitor on one side of the Irish Sea and as an Irish patriot on the other. And it had exactly the same effect on the people in Kerry who had stumbled across the evidence of his landing, but it took them in an opposite direction. These were ordinary people going about their daily business when they encountered Casement. They had no idea who he was, where he'd come from, or the significance of what they'd seen and found. But within 2 weeks, they'd been subpoenaed to give evidence and whisked off to London for his trial and not allowed to return home for 2 months until it finished at the end of June. They were pawns in a much bigger game, and they had a propaganda value as Irish loyalists supporting the Crown by helping to convict a traitor, and they're seen here, numbered 1 to 5, along with the other prosecution witnesses, mainly police and army personnel, in a celebratory photograph of the successful team outside the Royal Courts of Justice after the trial. But back at home, public opinion had been transformed in the wake of the rising, and they returned to a hostile homecoming when they were finally allowed to leave London. They were now regarded as traitors who had helped to put the noose around Casement's neck, traitors who had betrayed the nationalist cause. Their lives were never the same again, and their story is uniquely intertwined with Casement's trial and execution. But it's a story that remained largely untold for nearly a century, hidden behind half-truths, distortions, name-calling, whispers and taboos. Casement killers and casement hangers were just some of the epithets that were hurled at the witnesses and their families, even down to the next 2 generations. As one of their descendants put it to me, they were shamed in their own community. But that shaming was itself driven by a wider sense of guilt in Kerry that no one had come to Casement's rescue, that local nationalists had failed to act decisively and spring him from custody, that ultimately in Kerry he'd been abandoned to his fate. Once that story comes into view, you can see the excessive memorialising of Casement in Kerry for what it is, an overcompensation to hide the sense of shame and guilt. A man who embodied several paradoxes in his life, Casement left behind him a complex legacy in many parts of the world, including Kerry, where he cast a long shadow despite the shortness of his stay. So the exhibition provided the opportunity to throw a light on that shadow, to create a space where people could unfurl personal and family memories alongside the historical evidence, allowing memory to meet history and to recover a coherent sense of what actually happened, rather than face another century of bits and pieces of the truth. I think we're all aware that that meeting of memory and history will be even more difficult in the next phase of commemorations for all sorts of reasons. And the one we're least looking forward to in Kerry is the last part, the Civil War. Kerry was the site of some of the worst atrocities during the conflict, atrocities that are often depicted as the settling of local scores. But it's not really a local story. Several of these massacres were perpetrated by the newly formed National Army of the Irish Free State, something that the state never adequately acknowledged or took responsibility for, because that appalling savagery went right to the heart of the issue of the legitimacy of the new state and the authority and integrity of its army. That silence fanned the flames of bitterness on the other side, which glossed over its own part in the violence to give a very one-sided narrative of the civil war in Kerry that has endured right down to today. For the keepers of this flame, history is constructed from a sense of grievance that has never been assuaged, and it generates an unshakable certainty as to who were the heroes and who were the villains, who were the patriots and who were the traitors. But as more historical sources become available, hidden stories, large and small, inevitably will emerge to challenge the silence on one side and the certainty of the other. And the museum is, again, committed to creating a space where those stories can come into view. And difficult though this will be, the building itself has the capacity to provide some badly needed wider context. Completed in 1928, it was built as the seat of local government, one of the first and one of the very few new public buildings erected in the country after the foundation of the state. The money to build it came from the British government in compensation for the destruction of the old county hall by the Black and Tans during the War of Independence. But rather than rebuilding on the original site, the local authority chose to site the new building in the domain of the Denny estate, landlords of the town since the Elizabethan plantation in the 16th century. This was a deliberate statement in stone of the transfer of power to the new independent state. And finally, after the Civil War, it was where both sides of the divide, winners and losers, had to sit down together and participate in the running of a self-governing democracy, the achievement of which, in the end, was what all the fighting had been about. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Our next panellist I'd like to welcome is Paul Mullen. Paul Mullen is the head of Northern Ireland for the Heritage Lottery Fund and has been involved in a number of heritage, tourism and conservation projects over many years. Prior to working in the Heritage Lottery Fund, he worked with the National Trust and worked on the first World Heritage site management plan for the Giant's Causeway. He's a student both at Queen's University, Trinity College Dublin and Ulster University, where he's currently studying for his PhD in Heritage in a Divided Society. He's a current member of the Arts Council for Northern Ireland and a chair of the Decade of Centenaries Round Table here in Northern Ireland. He's also a member of the Irish Government's Expert Advisory Committee on the National Inventory of Intangible Culture and Heritage. I'd like to welcome Paul. Thank you.
Morning all. Let's see. Okay, I shall be speaking about the evolution of HLF's engagement with heritage in a divided society since 2006, and in particular around HLF and the Community Relations Council's joint working during the recent and ongoing Decade of Centenaries. I've got to do that in 10 minutes. Right. In 2007, the Heritage Lottery Fund organised a conference in Belfast, Digging Deeper, with the British Museum's Neil McGregor in the starring role. 11 years on, I could give you a word-for-word account of his presentation, but I won't, at least today. This conference signalled HLF's willingness to engage with heritage and identity, and in particular with the challenges that identity poses in a divided society. Namely, that the past can mean many different things to different people. These different views on the past are often shaped more by memory than by history. So it was for HLF as a funder to develop an approach that would enable communities to explore their past and what their heritage meant for them without further deepening division. But we also believed that having a better understanding of that past had to be of benefit for Northern Ireland society as a whole. An example. The Diamond War Memorial occupies a central position in Derry. It had been physically attacked by nationalists on a regular basis, as it was perceived as telling a story. that of a Unionist memorial commemorating Unionist First World War deaths. This was nothing to do with Derry nationalists. However, research uncovered something very different. A shared history commemorating the deaths of a near equal number of Catholics and Protestants, a memory that had been lost within that nationalist community. That fact transformed the site from one identified as exclusively Unionist Protestant heritage to one which was shared space, where meaning was open to different perspectives. This project brings up the distinction between history and memory in interesting ways, a theme that runs through the whole decade. It is a fantastic example of how engaging and difficult heritage can achieve so much. In particular, it shows what can be gained by changing the narrative. In Northern Ireland, commemoration is not benign. It brings you immediately into identity politics. The period in question, 1912 to 23, contained key events that still have great significance today in Irish life and politics. The Third Home Rule Bill and the reaction to it, the First World War, the Easter Rising, the War of Independence from Britain, partition and civil war. This presentation describes HLF's collaboration with the Community Relations Council over the last 8 years. 1916. Here we have images of the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme, events which fed into very differing narratives and which are seen as providing the foundation myths for nationalist and unionist memory, and which are at the heart of the divisions within Northern Ireland society still today. The commemoration of both these events represented both the challenge and opportunity in a divided society like Northern Ireland. The Taoiseach in 2010 set the tone for the whole of the island. He saw it as a decade of opportunity where the separate histories, British and Irish, Orange and Green, Republican, Nationalist, Unionist and Loyalist, could be explored, and for the process of commemoration to recognise the totality of history of the period and all of the diversity it encompasses. The French thinker Paul Ricoeur would describe this as a narrative hospitality, something that seems lacking in the Brexit debate, the ability to recognise and respect other people's stories. However, I would make reference to a key distinction between north and south of the island. In the north, these events are primarily about history. In the south, these events are primarily about history rather than memory. Whereas in the north, we seem to live our past on a daily basis, with the events of 100 years ago still at the heart of contemporary debate. This is an image from a Loyalist area in Belfast. Here, history and memory allied and become corrupted as history is put into contemporary use. In this image, two distinct memorials become one. Through those commemorated here, the heroism of the First World War is linked to the darker times of the recent Troubles. The purpose seems to legitimise the connection between a contemporary paramilitary group, the Ulster Volunteer Force, a group who took their name from the earlier UVF, who were formed in 1912 in resistance to Home Rule, and who provided the bulk of Unionist First World War stories. So the image of the left identifies the names of people from the First World War, and on the right, some more contemporary individuals. I could present many images across the divide where community memory overcomes a shared historical understanding. It's not just on the Loyalist side, the Republican side here are equally complicit. This was a challenge to anyone engaging in commemoration throughout this period. That challenge was at the heart of CRC's and HLF's working together. In 2011, a conference, Remembering the Future, kicked our joint working off. A wider reference group of interested parties was also drawn together. The objective was to support constructive commemoration. This was not about controlling commemoration. We did not want to tell communities how to commemorate, but we could support efforts towards constructive commemoration. To facilitate this work, oh dear, this shouldn't happen. I'm not going to lie. To facilitate this work, a set of principles was developed. All groups engaging in the decade were encouraged to use them. The Northern Ireland Executive, Belfast City Council, and many others adapted them for their own use. And this approach can be summarised as building on ethics and evidence. So the principles that you can see there are to start from the historical facts. It's amazing whenever you deal with memory, how facts simply sort of escape reality. Recognize the implications and consequences of what happened, understand that different perceptions and interpretations exist, and show how events and activities can deepen understanding of the past. Another key approach, this is the Ulster Museum, was the role of public spaces. The galleries in the Ulster Museum have been important in setting the context for commemoration and have been fully utilised by communities. The galleries create an evidence space, facts again, a space where myths can be challenged and memory reconstructed from the evidence. As well as the Ulster Museum, the Public Records Office, libraries and local museums have enabled groups to draw on them as a resource. Other information and resources was available, some of which you've got down here, so please do take them. We don't want to be taking them back to the office afterwards. Research has shown the importance of stimulating ideas for what can be done at a local level. Who to go to for support in developing programs, lectures and events, where to go for research, how to develop research skills. Conferences and resource fairs were also organised. Now I'd like to look at a couple of projects that showed how all of this played out. This was a single identity project, training loyalist bandsmen to become tour guides. This project was developed in response to the decade. Within the paramilitary landscape, UDA areas, there are two paramilitary groups, particularly within the loyalist community, UDA and sort of UVF. UDA areas have less affinity to the First World War, the dominant theme for the decade for Unionists. The First World War is seen as being primarily of UVF interest. So this group's exploration of its past looked into the deeper past, where they discovered Sandy Row's role in the building of Belfast. This approach opened up the band to wider perspectives, helped them to challenge existing, more inward thinking, and think differently about where they came from. They moved from seeing themselves as victims of the past to actors in their community's future. The results have been impressive in terms of building self-esteem, creating jobs, and participating in wider initiatives. You had 15 guys who started off who were unemployed, 13 of which now are employed in some aspect of tourism. Here we can see how history can challenge memory in very positive ways. Here we have a nationalist single identity project about recovering the stories of nationalists and the Great War, a heritage ignored for 90 years. The consequences of the Easter Rising and the history of Northern Ireland from 1921 and the British Army's role during the Troubles had wiped the story of the involvement of Irish Catholics in the war from their community narrative. Here we had ex-Republican activists rediscovering their own families' connections with the British Army. This group were also at the heart of the Messine Association, which brings ex-paramilitary groups from both sides together. Sitting in a room with loyalist activists and ex-Republican activists debating about the future is quite a fascinating and interesting experience and does show how far we've moved on in Northern Ireland. Recovering history to reshape memory has been at the heart of the decade of centenary stories. So what have we learned? Heritage has a unique power to engage communities. That's something that's at the heart of HLF's work, and it's at the heart of all museums' work. And that's why conferences like this, I think, are so important, because museums and the work that the likes of HLF does is there to open up to communities and to people the real value of heritage and connecting them with the present and future. An ethical and evidence-based approach allows communities to engage with difficult and challenging heritage. That's our great learning about this. Communities that thought the past was too difficult, they can engage with it in an appropriate way. Museums and libraries are a remarkable and core resource in this regard and need to be resourced to do that work. What has worked in a divided society like Northern Ireland can benefit the UK in a post-Brexit context where identity politics hangs over us. I think we've learned quite a lot. And in conclusion from me, and this is something that comes up quite a lot and it's come up a lot this morning, it's about complicating the narrative, opening yourself to these plural ways of thinking, exploring multiple narratives. Narratives which are international. No event is solely local. It connects into something wider and much more globally significant. What's the role of women and families? What's the shared experience in all of this? So opening up thinking to multiple perspectives is fundamentally important. Putting yourselves in the shoes of others. I find, I must say, reading the German philosopher Hannah Arendt incredibly important in this regard, and particularly in terms of the modern day. But a key element is also building challenge and debate into the process. One of the great learnings, particularly through art events that have been held in relation to the decade centenaries and plays, has been the debate afterwards. And that's where minds truly engage with some of these critical themes. And that way you can start to bring out the interconnectedness of these narratives. In Northern Ireland, we started off with monolithic identities on either side of the divide, which didn't seem to touch each other. Yet that's the real opportunity in heritage work, is to show how these stories actually are entwined. They cannot separate each other out from that. And that's the power of the work that's been done through the decade of centenaries. Thank you very much. Oh yeah, one final. Oops, I should have said, if you want to read, there's more detail. Book published, that was published yesterday. Routledge, Heritage in the Divide, Heritage After Conflict, 2018, Maguire and Crook. I have a chapter in it on all of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, Lar and Helen. And I'm going to ask, I suppose, as I've heard really rich material that has looked at, I think, very complex stories and very complex themes, both in Northern Ireland and Ireland, it also strikes me that while those themes and stories are linked, they're not cemented in the same time and in the same way in each jurisdiction. And I've a lot of questions running through my head, but I suppose the main one is having reflected on each other's presentations and obviously on your own work, what is it you think that in the last period covering the decade that we've not covered, that gets left out? And is that important, particularly as we think about the challenges ahead? Because we were all, I think, very conscious that by taking an approach to the decade, we were sort of leading towards something in the future and trying to negotiate very difficult history. So my question is around, what do you think got left out? Is that important? And what relevance is that in terms of us tackling difficult issues, or these difficult issues as we go forward? Helen, maybe you first.
Well, I think when we discuss this, I think actually it's probably something Lara is probably better able to tease out, in that it was the 1918 conscription crisis which didn't really get the airing in the Republic that it probably should have gotten. I think probably because by this year everyone is just bloody well commemorated out, and we want to take a break for a year or two before we go and do some more of the hard stuff. But I don't know, Lara, do you want to talk about that?
We're about to go into a period with the War of Independence where it's very much the myth of the War of Independence is battles and shootings and fighting, but the reality is most people, 30% of all casualties were shot by shotguns. So it's a very personal type of battle, but it's heavily romanticized in song and in books. What was interesting about this year, and I think Helen's right, that maybe it's the same people have been doing that, carrying the commemoration since 2012, that everyone needed a break. But 1918 is an important moment in Irish history because there's an attempt to introduce conscription in Ireland, and in many ways the whole of society joins together to protest against it. And what you get is a mass movement in a society against violence. And the irony, of course, is that within a year we'll be involved in a war of independence. So there was, I think, a missed opportunity to do what we did in 2016 and actually encourage people to come out on the streets and remember that there was a moment in 1918 where there was a mass movement against the war, World War I, and there was this moment where people like Eamon De Valera, who's now president, or then president of Sinn Féin, suddenly was talking to the Roman Catholic Church, who were then talking to other political parties. People on the Labour movement side were all singing with one voice. So there was that kind of missed opportunity, I think, in 2018. But Helen is right. I think it's...
there was some work done around the role of women in terms of conscription.
And you had and you on the 7th of June. But the point I'm making is that it should have been on the same scale as we did in 2015 and 2016. I would have liked to have seen O'Connell Street closed down, and I think it needed a scale. There was some nice work done, and I was involved in some of the projects, but it was very much at a very small level, and I feel it needed to be taken at a national level.
Thank you. Paul?
I'd just focus on something that is yet to happen and needs to happen and should not be left out, and that is what people tend to forget is that the United Kingdom as we know it now started with partition. There was no United Kingdom in the current context prior to that, because the whole of Ireland was part it was Great Britain and Ireland. And that plays so heavily into the whole sort of Brexit debate. And the Brexit debate seems to have forgotten about that aspect until it came up and started to bite people in the whole sort of debate now about the Irish border. And in terms of how all of that plays into identity and plays into the debates about who we are as a society, that's incredibly, incredibly important. And we need to see, I think, greater engagement right across the whole of the UK in that understanding and in that discussion.
Thank you. And I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the floor. And my question is around, to what degree do you think those three aspects of state, civil society, museums, etc., and were active, and what was the level of participation from the grassroots and from the public? Lar? Sorry.
Sure. I think with, in particular, 2016, there was huge participation. A lot of the other commemoration events, though, weren't well attended. And I have a fear, having two young daughters, that when, after a while, the various events that you went to, it was the same people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s. And you wonder how much the messaging that Paul was talking about, and they're trying to explain how complicated it is, that seeping into a younger generation. And I think that's part of the challenges. And my own 12-year-old daughter took her takeaway from the commemorations in 2016 was that the English were very bad, which wasn't what was being explained, but that was her takeaway. And it's a takeaway of a shy and innocent 12-year-old, but that was her takeaway. And we won't really see the impact of these commemorations, this first part, and how it's impacted on the under 25s until 2025.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I think the government made such a huge effort with 2016, and there was so many different, all the local authorities were involved, the Department of Education, I mean the schools were driven daft, doing 1916 projects and all of that. And so it really did generate that excitement for various different events that were happening and so on. But and people could get around, it was much, in some ways, a simpler story. It's going to be very difficult to see how that's going to happen with the next bit, which, as someone said to me, is all the killy shooty bit, and what do you do with that? There aren't, that will be different. But I think it really did work for 2016, but it took a huge effort. And I don't know if you can sustain that level of effort over the next, however, God knows how many years we've left in this.
Thank you. Paul?
I think things in Northern Ireland were quite different. There was a lack of state engagement, except for various memorial events around the First World War. And really, success for us, if I can define it this way, was the fact that events which we thought had the potential to spill over to violence actually weren't violent at all, and that we saw a greater sense of understanding, a kind of deepening of narratives in both communities. But you're not talking in Northern Ireland about mass participation in any way, but more slow but sure learning that needs to continue on, and we need to ensure that learning continues, because we are not out of the woods yet, given that we're sort of working towards the years up to the years of where partition came into place, and that poses just a massive challenge for the society.
Yes, thank you. And the troubles after that. Any questions from the floor? There was a lady at the back standing beside the person with the mic, or sitting beside, yeah. And then there's someone about 3 or 5.
Yeah, thank you. More an observation than a question. I'm Linda McKenna. I work at Down County Museum in Downpatrick. My concern, and I've worked in the museum for a long time, I've been involved in peace projects. I have a couple of concerns. One is that one of the things that we seem to have been doing over the past number of years in looking at commemorating these various events is we've pushed people into designating themselves nationalist, unionist. We've implied that everybody in the whole of Ireland at that time was caught up in a Home Rule crisis, the First World War, 1916 rebellion, conscription crisis. The majority of people were not. They were obviously impacted by these things, but they actually were trying to live their normal, everyday, ordinary lives during this time. Commemoration by asking people to actually, look at these things. I'm not saying we shouldn't, of course we should. We've been encouraging people to say the nationalist experience was, the unionist experience was, oh, by the way, nationalists were also involved in World War I, unionists were also involved in conscription crisis, but we're still designating people as being nationalist, unionist, and asking them in a way to take a side that it didn't actually take at the time, perhaps. I think in a way we've been actually encouraging the retrospective interpretation of history. That wasn't the case at the time by a lot of these commemorations. So I think there's a big issue there in us actually, encouraging the labelling of people. And I think that's something that we need to be very, very careful about. The majority of people at this period were trying to live an everyday life in very difficult circumstances. Do you understand what I mean? So I think that museums have a responsibility to actually say, yes, these things were happening, they impacted everybody in different ways, people had different attitudes to things, but by and large, people were not, obsessing with whether they were nationalist or unionist. And they certainly weren't obsessing with how things would be commemorated in the future. And I do think that we have contributed to the labelling of people again and again and again. We haven't been looking at things like what was everyday life like during at this period. I come from North County Dublin, and certainly in 1918 in North County Dublin, that people were far more exercised about the ongoing strike among agricultural labourers, which was impacting their daily lives all the time. They were in effect locked out for longer than they had been in 1913. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes,
yeah. So I'm very concerned about that. I think it's a real issue at that, And as you say, in 20 years' time, what will we have done to actually keep people thinking about themselves as being either nationalist or unionist?
Thank you. I'll take a couple of other questions, comments, and then go back to the panel. There was someone, a lady 3 rows back, with her hand up, or 4 rows back. And is there anybody over the other side of the room? Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Sandra Stankler from Historic England. I had the good fortune to visit the Easter Rising exhibition in Dublin in 2016, and my takeaway was that the English were very bad too, so I have sympathy with your daughter. However, I suppose I was really intrigued by the principles that the last speaker talked about, and the use of facts to dispel long-held beliefs, which may be based on memory, but which may be inaccurate. To what degree do you think that you have been successful in challenging those long-held beliefs and changing people's mind?
Thank you. One last question, and I'll put it over to the panel. Anyone? No? Okay. I suppose 2 questions. One is around, I suppose, the stories of ordinary life. Does that get lost in these big pictures, and are we inadvertently feeding into that? And the second one around, I suppose, the principles in particular, but this issue about facts and dispelling long-held myths. Paul, and then Lar.
I think the first point mentioned there about too great a focus on nationalists and unionists. I think you're absolutely right. That's what we've got to ensure that is avoided. Part of our work has been in Northern Ireland is in terms of in recognising that communities were going to remember in whatever way they wanted, but to provide resources to try and encourage them to think more broadly and encourage them to think in very different ways, to challenge some of those particular stereotypical narratives of amongst sort of nationalists and unionists. And so a lot of our resources would have gone towards that. And we've always got to be conscious of that. We've got to ensure that, and I think museums have been very good at this, trying to come up with different stories that don't simply fall into those sloppy narratives. In terms of the second point about sort of facts, we had quite a few historians were involved in pulling together those set of principles, and the words of facts were debated quite, can we use such a term as facts? But the general feeling was that term was good because people understood it. And while one can debate, about facts and their interpretation, by getting people to focus more on the evidence, that was what was to be achieved out of all of this. Looking at evidence, bringing out the evidence, and ensuring that those public institutions that had an opportunity to do that would do that well.
Before I bring Laura in, there's a gentleman here with a question.
Stephen Snoddy, director of the New York Gallery, Walsall. I was brought up in Belfast in the 1970s. I went to school in Lisburn. I went to Quaker school. I come from a Quaker family. My question is that the great work that you've done gives different narratives, and there's an interconnection, as you say, between loyalism, unionism, republicanism, and nationalism. Those lessons that have been learnt, are they feeding back into the educational system? Because I paraphrase in that Catholic schools taught Irish history, Protestant schools taught British history. I was lucky, I went to a school that treated the whole of history, and I learned British history and Irish history. So have the lessons that have been learned and the history that's been revealed feeding its way into the young people of Northern Ireland and the young people of Ireland through education?
Thank you. I'll come back to your question, and Lar, and then Helen, and then I'll come back to your question, because it's quite specific. Yeah. Just
in relation to the other questions, I agree with you about the duty of museums to explain that in many cases, in relation to our own revolution, it's only about, as I said, mentioned in the talk, 17,000 people, men and women, were involved. Life goes on, and we try to do that in the exhibitions that we had at the National Museum. It is a very small group. 200,000 Irish men and women served with the British Army, a larger figure, which is, as I say, largely forgotten for the 20th century. So it is important to explain that this is a cadre of revolutionaries, a small group that leads to such great change through 16 and through the War of Independence. In relation to facts and myths, that's part of the challenges within the 1916 exhibition. We do talk about the fact that many of the responding British Army soldiers are Irish. The Irish soldiers were involved in the executions of the leaders. So these are uncomfortable truths, but they are talked about in the exhibition. It's essential that we do that. And if you don't mind, I just respond to the third question. It's a key one. My 12-year-old is now 13, and she's going into secondary school, and she doesn't have to do history anymore. They've just introduced a new ruling that she doesn't have to do history under the junior cert, which is the equivalent to the O-levels. So in a way, her very exciting 2016, when they did everything about 1916, could be her last grasp with our complicated history. She's decided to do history herself this year. But she could at any stage opt out of that class, and historians in Dublin are making, and around Ireland are making a big case that history should really be mandatory up to the age of 16, so that we can explain our history, because there isn't proper civics courses. So in many ways, to understand how complicated it is north and south in our schools in the south, we rely heavily on our history teachers to tell that complicated story.
Helen?
Yeah, just on that last point, I can't speak about Northern Ireland, but I think, there's such a dissonance in the last few years between, the government is so supportive of the commemorations and all of that, while at the same time taking history off the curriculum for secondary schools. It doesn't add up, and particularly as we face into the next few years and with all the problems with Brexit. So I think you're right to raise that question. About the slotting people into the different categories and all the rest of it, what I would like to do in our exhibition that will come up for the Civil War is to put a bicycle at the centre of the exhibition, because rather than a gun, Because a lot of the sources that we use, and Lara's right to say that it is very well sourced period of history, but a lot of those sources are about the people that were involved in terms of shooting and killing and all that sort of stuff, and carrying dispatches. But what are really interesting, and they are now becoming more available, are the financial compensation files, where ordinary people sued for compensation because their property was destroyed, or the retaliations were performed, and all this sort of stuff. But one of the biggest things is they're looking for compensation for the theft of a bike. So you have on the one hand the people running around shooting and killing people on their bicycles, but those bicycles are stolen from ordinary people who are going, okay lads, whatever, you might want to live and fight and die for Ireland, but I want my bloody bike, and I want the money for my bloody bike because it's important to me. And it just goes to show that all of that ordinary life was going on. Even as I mentioned, the massacres in Kerry happened about, I think in total, something like 25 men were killed in horrible, blown up, horrible explosions. But in that same month, there was, just about a week after, there was a compensation case where the people were suing for compensation because their cowshed had been burnt down, and it was burnt down by boys and girls who had liked to dance in this shed, but the people who owned the shed locked it so they couldn't get into it to continue their dancing. So the dancing boys and girls burnt the shed down. And it just goes to show you that you're right, that things like that happen all the time, and it's not just the shooty-killy stuff that goes on. And I think that will be very important for us in the next phase of it as well. Whether we have convinced anyone with evidence, I don't know. That's really, I think, you can only put the evidence out there and say to people where you've got it from, and just can't make people's minds up for them. You know, if they want to make up their mind about this is a fact or an alternative fact, you know, your bit is to put the evidence out there, I think.
I'll bring Paul in and then I'll conclude. Thank you.
Yeah, and just very briefly, from a Northern Ireland perspective, the whole educational side, clearly not enough is done. Schools can opt out of certain aspects of our history, and given the challenges that we have and moving towards how we view Europe and whatever, we need much more understanding so that people can make and be informed for the future. That's fundamental.
And I just add to that, I mean, it is patchy, and there have been some excellent projects, Coromila Nerve Centre, and there's been some amazing graphic novels that have been delivered, you know, with 2 stories back to front on the Easter Rising and the Battle of the Somme, and delivered into every primary school in Northern Ireland. But it's still the case that schools, in a sense, will choose which parts of the curriculum to do, whether they'll do, you know, modern Irish history or they'll do the Holocaust, and that'll break down to a degree on maintained schools and controlled schools. I'm sorry we've gone over time. I hope that hasn't had an adverse effect. But thank you all for coming this morning, and thank you to Paul, Lar and Helen for excellent presentations. And finally, again, there are publications at the front that are case studies of the work in Northern Ireland and some of the learning, and please take them. Thank you.
just after midday, so I think I can say good afternoon to everybody that's here. And I'd like to welcome you to our panel session, our discussion panel session called Bridge Over Brexit. So there's no disguising what it is all about. But my name is Professor Elizabeth Crook, and I work at Ulster University running the Museum Studies programs there. So for ourselves here on the island, and particularly for the museum sector, both north and south, the consequences of Brexit are felt very deeply, and we're very concerned to continue thinking about what it may mean for the cultural museum and arts sector here on this island, and our relationship with the rest of the UK and the EU. So about a year ago, the Irish Museums Association hosted a Brexit event in Belfast, and we had a really good representation of the Irish museum sector there, and colleagues came over from across the water as well. And the outcome of that day was this report, Brexit and the Museum Sector in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which can still be downloaded online. So we thought a year ago, and the contributors here beside me were all part of this event and a part of this process, and we thought a year ago we would have, by the time this conference came along, a very clear idea of what Brexit would mean for these islands. I'm afraid we don't. We still don't, and I'm sure you feel the same way. So we're still exploring it, and that's why this panel still is so important, because of that. So we don't have a very clear idea of what Brexit means, continually being negotiated. Unfortunately, it's so continuous in the press that some people actually just want to close off their ears to Brexit. They can't bear it anymore, and I think that could be part of the overall agenda. But as well as that context of the great unknown with Brexit, as many of you who've just come over to Northern Ireland for this conference, you may not be aware that we're also without a government in Northern Ireland. So Stormont hasn't sat since January 2017. Yes, I've got that date right. So we're 2 years without a government here, without a feeling that how do we operate democracy without having Stormont sitting? We don't have people who can really ask the right questions at a governmental level, and we can't direct questions. So we're really in a very tricky situation in Northern Ireland, and certainly look to our colleagues across the islands for guidance. So for us, this panel is extremely important, and the panel members that we've got here today, we feel can really give insights into what Brexit might mean for their institutions. And we're very keen to hear from all of you and what it might mean, you feel it may mean for you. And most of you should have got one of the postcards which we designed together for today, and we'd really appreciate if you could write a comment, a question, a comment, a drawing, whatever you want to put in. It's entirely anonymous, and leave it behind in the auditorium and give it to one of the volunteers. So if you haven't got a postcard, there's more up at the front. So we're really keen to keep that discussion going, because at the end of the day, this is something that's still a lot to be said and a lot to be understood about it. So I'd like to introduce our panel here. And we've got here, we've got Aoife Ruane from Drogheda Highlands Gallery, which is in the Republic of Ireland. We have Rhiann Coulter from Banbridge F.E. McWilliam Gallery, which is just outside Belfast, sort of halfway between Belfast and the border. Would that be right? Approximately. We've Heather McGuckin, who is curator and manager of Northdown Museum, which is on the North Coast, and she's also chair of the Northern Ireland Regional Curators Group. And we have Liam Bradley from Monaghan, who's the director and manager curator of Monaghan County Museum, which is just on the border. So for people with really clear insights of the potential of impact of Brexit in their museum. So each of our panel members are just going to speak for a few minutes just to introduce their position for the moment in relation to Brexit. So would you like to go first?
Thanks, Marie Elizabeth. Hi. Today I'm going to talk about the development of 2 museums and galleries in a cross-border context, the importance of their existence for their communities and for the region, and how the tenets of their development, the idea of partnership, has informed how they work, and how they can be seen both as an example of how to work across borders, and then I'm going to end with posing a question about what is required in this time of change to protect and secure this cross-border relationship, and the other possible informal relationships that our museum and galleries have in Northern Ireland, Ireland and the UK. So you'll see from some of the slides behind us, Highlands Gallery, as you see when you see the map slide, is located in Drogheda in the Republic of Ireland, as Elizabeth said, on the southern border with Northern Ireland. It is a municipal art gallery for Drogheda in the northeast, a regional gallery in County Louth. It was developed with the Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio in Banbridge, Northern Ireland, north of Drogheda as you look at the map, with a driving distance of 50 minutes, just 50 minutes between them, or 48 miles or 78 kilometres, depending on what system you use. Just over a decade ago, and in a cross-border arts partnership that had and around the idea of 2 art collections. In Drogheda, the Drogheda Municipal Art Collection, featuring Irish and international artists, had been begun by a couple, artist B. Orpin and businessman Terry Trench, in 1946, and in Banbridge, the local authority had been collecting the work of Effie McWilliam, or Frederick Edward McWilliam, the important sculptor and a native of Banbridge, whose career had brought him to London in the early 20th century. The capital project to realise these institutions began in the 1990s in the wake of the Good Friday Agreement, and was essentially between 2 local authorities, Drogheda Borough Council and Banbridge District Council, and their executives. And in this significant project of cross-border cooperation, the aim was to provide a major cultural and tourism resource for the border region in the 2 galleries, to attract international visitors and to encourage longer stays. But most importantly, this project had at its heart a serious effort to increase cross-community and cross-border cooperation through arts and culture. So while the 2 local authorities committed substantial funds, along with the International Fund for Ireland and community and individual donations, the major vehicle for the enterprise was enabled by the European Union Fund through the Northern Ireland Interreg 3A programme, and managed for the special EU programmes bodied by the East Border Region Interreg 3A partnership. The partnership receiving capital funding for the development of both institutions. And after many years of committed cross-border work by the collective councils, external advisors and stakeholders, Highlands Municipal Art Gallery, housed in a former Franciscan church, and you'll see it on the slides, opened 12 years ago in October 2006, while the Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio, a new build, opened 18 months later in 2008. In the last 2 decades, the significant work that has been done in the name of peace and reconciliation on the island in projects like ours has meant that where borders and difference once existed, now cooperation, working together, and a focus on mutual heritage, a commonality, and an acceptance of conflicted histories now exists. In one of the images above, you'll see 2 artefacts, the Mace and Sword of Drogheda, which are now on permanent view since 2010 in Highlands Gallery. They were given to the Corporation of Drogheda by King William of Orange after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. These objects for many years remained locked away in the strong room of the council offices in Drogheda and taken out only for special groups, mostly from Northern Ireland, to privately view. These important objects and potent symbols for which so long had divisive connotations can now be viewed as icons of our shared heritage and continuing good relations. Neither the team at Highlands Gallery, or I can safely say for Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio, take our good relationships and partnership for granted, as in reality this is all still quite new and potentially fragile. I was reminded of this recently when the Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio celebrated their first decade, and at a ceremony where a significant number of the original council officials, many now retired, attended. Many who spent years working cross-border with council officials in Drogheda and Louth. These guardians of our galleries were still present, aware, and quietly continuing to support and witness our very special cultural enterprise in this next decade and in this changing political landscape. It has been such an exciting and invigorating time working along the border and in partnership with Effie McWilliam Gallery and Studio, both institutions striving and achieving full museum accreditation within our jurisdictions, engaging and attracting audiences for art, working with our collections and supporting artist practice. We've shared many exhibitions through the years between our galleries, shared audiences, shared connections and contacts, research and experience, as well as practical things like equipment. We've seen the Northeast come alive with art and with the arts and culture, both incoming and outgoing. In fact, that very part of our joint genetic code that is about partnership has become so integral to how both of our galleries operate, with other galleries and institutions both on the island and with our museum, gallery and collection colleagues in the UK. Partnership is central to how we capitalise and add value for our projects in development, working with artists on ambitious projects and installations, and both extending our own collections out and in turn borrowing from national collections on the island, from the UK and across Europe. In this time also, the Arts Council of Ireland and Northern Ireland have also enabled cross-border funding for touring exhibitions, which we have taken full advantage of in major exhibitions of senior Irish artists and Northern Irish artists like Susan McWilliam and Janet Mullarney. We know that through partnership, we can achieve a whole lot more. This conference and its timing has been significant for Ian Coulter and I and our museum and galleries, as in the next few weeks we make our very first cross-border exhibition that will run simultaneously in both galleries. Titled Crossing Lines, it expresses both the strength of our relationship and the others that we have with the Arts Council's collection in London, as well as the National Museums Northern Ireland, where we will together borrow work and as well as from artist studios, including that of Nigel Rolfe and George Gerard. The timing of this conference, 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement, and I know for the second time in Northern Ireland, is important, as are the overarching themes of dissent, dissonance and difference, as they will be explored in this exhibition. So, while the Republic of Ireland will continue within the European Union, and with the changes Brexit brings for Northern Ireland and the United Kingdom, and as borders potentially become a reality, metaphorically and or physically, what will this mean for our cross-border relationship? From our perspective, partnerships across the island and in the UK, it has taken us 20 years to get to this position of collaboration, and we're now only reaping the benefit of that creative thinking. The public cares, artists care, curators care about what's on the horizon. What can we do to ensure the fluidity and the imagination of our partnership and partnerships, to protect them for our communities, for our audiences, for our artists, and the dynamism and neighbourliness that is a key feature of our relationships? What do we need to ensure that this vibrancy and connectedness continues across our EU, non-EU borders in Ireland, Northern Ireland and the UK, and that they're not diminished or lost? We know good relationships, good projects take time, and they are about interpersonal relationships and commitment. They are about people and not borders. And I suppose I wonder, is there a role for informal relationships in informing policy for museums? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Aoife, and I think she's asked some really important questions there about how do we maintain the important relationships that we have been built for so long. Like when I was growing up in Northern Ireland, the border was a very obvious place. If you went across the border, I went to the beach in Donegal. You went through a checkpoint and your boot would be opened and they would check and look at the buckets and spades and the towels and say, yes, they are going to the beach. So, you know, we do not, none of us want to go back to that. But what has happened in the last 20 years is an invisible border. And it's both physically invisible and also fading into the background of our minds. So that when you talked about the metaphorical border, that's what we have now. It has faded back, and that's why the partnerships that you've described didn't happen overnight and now still need to be nurtured very much. So we'll continue maybe on that theme with yourself, Brianne. So, let's do this. Ooh.
It's very heavy. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Aoife. I think Aoife's done a great job of sort of explaining how we work together between the Highlands and the FE. So I suppose I want to just talk a little bit about the reality of working in a museum on the border and what Brexit may bring. So, as Aoife has described, the F.E. McWilliam Gallery was born out of a cross-border collaboration. And when I took up the post of curator in 2009, it meant coming back to Northern Ireland, a place I'd left at the age of 19 to study and work in Dublin, London and the US. Although the gallery is only 20 minutes drive from the border and located just off the main Dublin to Belfast road, I was shocked by how little cross-border cooperation there was and how few connections. It just wasn't in the psyche of the people, no matter what side of the community they were from. Everyone looked to Belfast and then to London. Although the physical infrastructure of the border was gone, as Elizabeth pointed out, there was still for many a psychological border, a border of the mind. This situation was strengthened by the fact that the gallery was and is entirely run and funded by the local borough council. Obviously, local government politics in Northern Ireland is a reflection of our regional politics, and thus largely divided along unionist and nationalist lines, with their respective views on the border, national identity, and Europe. Our council was and is predominantly unionist, with all that implies. However, as Aoife has explained, the Effie McWilliam Gallery was built with European money and was from the beginning linked to the Highlands Gallery in Drogheda. Aoife and I had started our careers together at the Irish Museum of Modern Art in Dublin, and so ours was a natural collaboration, and one that, as Aoife has described, is very much an ongoing partnership. In addition to our relationship with the Highlands, we at the FE have also toured or co-curated exhibitions with many other institutions in the Republic of Ireland, including the National Gallery of Ireland, the Irish Museum of Modern Art, the Royal Hibernian Academy, NCAD, the Art College, and galleries in Kilkenny and Cork and West Cork. In each case, partnership and collaboration has allowed us to do more better. So what happens after Brexit? What has been happening since the referendum? We programmed 2 years in advance, and when I look at the schedule post-March 2019, there are only 2 exhibitions that will travel from the Republic to Banbridge, both interesting and important, but neither absolutely fundamental to our programme. All the others are either self-generated or may not tour or are coming from the mainland UK. I don't think I consciously planned this, but at some level perhaps I have been preparing for the worst. What I can't prepare for is the audiences we will lose if a hard border is imposed. A look around the gallery car park on any average day results in several Irish registrations. On a bank holiday weekend, every 3rd car is Southern. The big Tesco's and the outlet shopping centre across the road tell a similar story. Will they still come after March 2019? Will they be able to? We have a staff member who lives just across the border in Carlingford and numerous suppliers in Dublin and beyond. Will we still be able to tour exhibitions without huge import tariffs? Will we be able to handle the paperwork that might result in? Will artists still want to show in Northern Ireland? I know of numerous artists, curators, and academics who commute across the border every day. Will they decide it's time to jump ship? To be honest, the practical problems, while frightening and problematic, are not the worst of it. For me, the psychological effect is the biggest danger. After 10 years back in Northern Ireland, I'm only just getting used to the strange version of a post-conflict society that 30 years of violence has caused. Will Brexit turn Northern Ireland back in on itself, just as it's beginning to look outwards? Will it stop people travelling and living where they want? Of course, many of us in Northern Ireland have Irish passports, but I've had one all my life, and yet it was not until I travelled abroad and lived in Dublin that I actually felt that I had the right to identify as Irish, or indeed European. Cultural identity has been so contentious here that even thinking about what it meant to be Irish or British or somewhere in between was problematic. Despite all the brilliant artists, musicians and writers who have born and worked here in Northern Ireland, I think we're only just beginning to feel that we have the right to celebrate and feel pride in the unique shared culture of this place. Brexit threatens all of that. It threatens our culture, our economy, our way of life. What does it mean if we can't bring art exhibitions across the border? Museums help us to figure out who we are, where we come from, and where we're going. If Brexit forces us to turn our backs on the border, how can we hope to engage with or contribute to the culture, heritage and identity of our communities and our visitors? Most of all, Brexit makes me concerned that all the progress we have made in the 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement could come crashing down. I belong to that generation who grew up during the Troubles and came of age just as the ceasefire and the Good Friday Agreement were coming into being. We have been the beneficiaries of the EU. Europe helped the people of Northern Ireland move beyond their entrenched identities and communities and provided a bigger shared identity. That identity, our shared society, and our peace are juvenile and incredibly fragile. On a personal level, I fear for my children, their prospects, and the cultural environment in which they're going to grow up. Will they, like generations before them, leave as soon as they can, never to return? Brexit makes me question whether I did the right thing coming back here. It makes me wonder what will become of us and whether it wouldn't be better to move back to the right side of the border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rhiannon. And I think that is it's sort of part heartfelt plea, and part, you know, I think both papers have both said, drawn home the point that there's the practical issue, but there is that very much, you could say, emotional issue of what it means living on this island, and what it means to have good neighbours and good relationships. And in both presentations, the word fragility came up, about the fragile reality, and I think that's an important point for us to always consider. So next to speak, we have Heather McGuckin, as I said, from the Regional Curators Group and North Down Museum. Heather.
Hello. That side of the table has their papers and they're very organised, where Liam and I are much more, let's just go for it and give our experiences. I'm now wishing I had written a few notes, but anyway. So really, I'm here with two hats on. One is as the chair of the Northern Ireland Regional Curators Group, and that group was set up around 1988. And one of its main purposes when it started was to lobby government, and it was beneficial and pretty much helped begin the Northern Ireland Museums Council in Northern Ireland and kind of bring us up to par with the rest of the UK to have that service within this country. And really that group has continued on ever since. So it's made up of representatives from local authority museums across Northern Ireland. There are 44 accredited museums here, and just about half, just under half, are local authority. So it's a great way for us to get together, to network, to develop projects, to moan and discuss about the challenges we're facing within our local authorities, and everybody at the table understands exactly what you're going through. In Northern Ireland itself, and I know we're talking about Brexit, many of our local authorities are still going under the review or still going through the process of the review of public administration. So although Brexit is very important, many of them are so caught in their own governance issues within their local authorities merging into larger authorities, and the battles are still being fought, to be honest, on that front, let alone anything cross-border. So for many museums, that's all happening in conjunction with what's happening with Brexit and not knowing what's happening with Brexit. So that is an issue for local authority museums here. Our local authority museums, they are spread across, obviously, the country, and our experiences are all very different. Many of the ones closer to the border are doing fantastic cross-border work and have been for decades, really. And that has not necessarily been done because they've been told to do that. It's because they want to do that, and they want to develop relationships, and they see the importance of developing those relationships, cross-border, sharing collections, sharing history, sharing experiences. So my other hat is as the manager of North Down Museum, because we're 13 miles up the road and we're not near a border. So we have a different experience than perhaps our other local authority museums like Derry and like Fermanagh and like Newry. So it was also for me to kind of bring that side of it as well. And so after we decided to do this talk, I thought, well, we're not affected at all. We're not near the border. We're not affected. And then you do start to think about it a bit more, and you realize, well, actually, we probably are, and more than we realize. So for my museum in particular, we do have cross-border relationships already. We have one with Monaghan. We have one with Cavan. We share collections. And where possible, we do work together. But I've realized that a lot of this has been done through peace funding. And for us and for many local authority museums in Northern Ireland, that is a big worry as well. So it's very difficult to get money from your own council to do things within your own borough, let alone doing anything cross-border without additional outside funding. And for us, peace funding is where, it's peace and reconciliation funding, for those of you who don't know, is where we've been going to for years to develop cross-border projects that involve our museums, local communities, bringing communities together from both sides of the border. And even as a museum that's nowhere near the border, we've been doing that as well. We currently have 3 peace projects on the go, which look at our collections in our local communities and do go across the border as well where we can. So I think for me, speaking on behalf maybe of local authority museums, I think that for all of us will be a massive impact. And Piece 4 will now go up to 2020. I have heard Piece 5 has been declared, so there will be something past Brexit. But after that, what will happen is a worry. And if that funding is not there to allow us to continue these relationships, the will is there, but if there's not money to back us up, it might prove very difficult for us to be able to do that.
Okay. Thank you very much, Heather. And now we'll move to Liam Bradley from Monaghan County Museum.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I just wanted to start by thanking the Museum Association for facilitating our discussion today, and also the Irish Museum Association in particular, Gina Kelly, who's done so much work to develop and set up the talk today. So thank you for that, Gina. Like Heather, I'm wearing 2 hats today. The primary hat is as the chair of the Local Authority Museums Network. So for the few of you who don't know, I'm sure everyone knows who that is. There are 12 local authority museums in the Republic of Ireland. So the Local Authority Museums Network is a representative body for those 12 museums. We would meet 3 to 4 times a year in Dublin, typically in the National Museum. And we've been working for years with our counterparts and our partners in Northern Ireland through the Northern Ireland Regional Creators Group. And I suppose a lot of the speakers have already said that we've all grown up in that period of the Troubles ending, the reconciliation period after that. And we've seen an awful lot of positives come out of that. My other hat being the curator, director, manager, everything else in between of Monaghan County Museum, which is situated just a few miles south of the border in the Republic of Ireland. We have done a lot of work over the last 10, 15 years through peace and reconciliation funding, which has been a real bedrock to really start that discussion, start that hard work of bringing divided communities together, talking about very, very difficult issues, but using the collection as the catalyst. And I really believe that that is one of the real strengths of museums. That uniqueness, that specialness, the tactile aspect of it, it's right there. Something that maybe represents one thing to you, represents something else to somebody else in the room, but you can't ignore it. You have to talk about it. And that brings on another discussion. I think that's a real strength that museums have, both north and south. And I think looking forward now into Brexit, my feeling is it'll be grand. But I do believe there's a positive aspect to this as well. Necessity is a mother of invention after all. Brexit's coming, whether we like it or not. It's going to happen next March, probably. But it doesn't all have to be bad. You know, there's going to be challenges, yes, depending on whatever structure is put in place. Nobody knows what that structure is going to be. It may or may not affect the movement of staff and objects, and that may or may not have an effect on what we can do with our partners in the north and in hopefully the UK, on the mainland of Britain, in Wales, Scotland and England, that we can look to new partnerships. I think Piece 5 is going to come down the line and we'll certainly benefit from that. I think we are the only border between the UK, which will leave the EU, and the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU. I think the Republic of Ireland and the LMAN in particular are very strongly based to actually reach out to our regional partners, continue to build on the relationships in the north, and look for opportunities in England, in Scotland and in Wales, because one thing that Brexit has shown us is that there is certainly divided communities in England, in Scotland and Wales that voted either side of it, voted to leave and to remain, and you can argue all day for the social, political reasons for that, but they're there anyway. The other thing about them is that they're subtle and they're nuanced. It's very hard to put your finger on it. It's very hard to say, well, that house definitely voted to leave, that house definitely voted to remain. It's a little bit easier in Belfast if you're walking around. You can sort of spot the unionist areas and the nationalist areas. They're very decent about that. They put up their flags and they paint things, and it makes it very, again, very convenient. You know where to pop out and with your Free State accent and ask for directions, and where not. But I mean, I'm joking just to make a bit of a lighter aspect of the subject. The fact is, nuanced borders are something that we've dealt with for years. We've looked at for years the Catholic and Protestant aspect, Protestant Unionist loyalists, Catholic nationalist, Republican side of it. Brexit's turned that 90 degrees. Now we've got Catholics and Protestants who voted to remain, Catholics and Protestants who voted to leave. And we have to look at our partners, potential partners then in England, Scotland and Wales. You can't touch that funding anymore. That money's going to be gone after March for you. It won't be for us though. Depending on whatever structure that may take, there will be opportunities, I believe, through the back door to reach out to new communities, to new partners and say, look, okay, you can't directly interact with this funding, but we're doing a programme here looking at how borders, subtle borders in community and how we can overcome them. You have them as well, different ones, but the same. And the one thing I believe is there's way more that binds us and separates us. And the final point I'll make is, you know, in museums we're all just people. Yes, we have headings, we have titles, and we have backgrounds, we have lots of qualifications, and it's all very fancy. But at the end of the day, we're just people. We come from places and we have our own prejudices, we have our own backgrounds. We all have a love and a passion for museums and history. And that's one thing, I think, that will lead to more opportunities post-Brexit in the long term than maybe the initial challenges will bring.
Okay, thank you very much, Liam. I'm sort of a little bit reminded of New Year's Eve 2000, when we thought the airplanes would fall out of the sky because they weren't Y2K ready. So in a sense, are we Brexit ready? Are you stockpiling? Who is stockpiling? Is anybody here stockpiling? We've also got the added concern in Ireland that our milk is processed, and my brother's a dairy farmer, his milk is processed across the border. What will happen to his milk? Can they cross the border in time? And even worse, Guinness is kegged in Northern Ireland. So if you're not getting your Guinness across the water, it's because you voted Brexit. I'm sure none of you voted Brexit. But so that is the scenario planning we're talking about. And just for in the next sort of 5 minutes before we open it up to the floor, I have 2 questions for the panel and maybe 1 question for the audience. So my 2 questions are in the area of what is your scenario planning, if you want to say quite briefly. And the second question is with regard to identity, and we've talked a lot about the importance of exploring what identity means on this island and the contribution the cultural sector has to exploring identity issues, and what role will a museum have beyond Brexit to address and explore the multi aspects to identity. So not everybody here has that. You don't have to answer all the questions, but maybe across this way, if you've got thoughts on scenario planning.
Okay, well, I mean, I think very simply, I mean, one is going to expect that there's going to be taxes and tariffs. So there's, you know, and then obviously there'll be additional considerations in relation to customs. So I think for us, we're certainly assuming that that will change how we work, but it won't stop how we work. And I think in that way that we're continuing to work, we're planning a partnership with a museum and gallery in Peterborough in the UK next year on an artist who originally his family came from Ireland. His name is Graham Crowley, and we'll continue to work with museums and galleries where we can. But I suppose that it does have practical considerations, but I think in a way it may affect budget and time would be where I think just very simply. And then in relation to identity, I mean, I've spoken about the fact that Rhiannon and I, you know, we're, I suppose, exploring multiple ideas around dissonance and dissent within this next exhibition, which will look at, I suppose, gender, sexuality, race, class, and so we'll be exploring that difference, I suppose, in our next exhibition.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And Liam, you're hoping for a positive outcome from Brexit. Like, are you scenario planning for that, for what you might do in the coming years?
Look, I mean, I'm not sitting here saying that, you know, I've drank the Kool-Aid and I'm sort of on one side completely. I'm just saying that there's an opportunity here. There's opportunities everywhere. We just have to see them from what they are. Am I specifically planning for it? No, because I have no idea what Brexit's going to be. Nobody does. There's no wise old man or old woman who can tell me right now how it's all going to go. There's just us. You know, as a group here collectively, we're going to have to figure it out together. But I do believe if the will's there, and I really do believe it is, and again, that's born in 20 years now of experience in museums, where people realise that cooperation is the strength of any museum. You know, a project is good on its own, but it's 10 times better if you're working with other organisations. And I think those overarching themes will literally and figuratively get over that border. So we're going to continue to reach out in the short term to our partners in the north, and we're going to be looking very hard for partners in Britain as well. But no, I mean, honestly, there's nothing specific at the moment, no.
Okay, and do you want to make a final point?
Yeah, well, as I said, I mean, really looking forward, we only have a couple of exhibitions, like full exhibitions, which are coming from the south, which is unusual for us because the last couple of years, everything has been coming back and forth. But I think it's going to make us work differently. If you think about bringing a whole exhibition of sculpture or painting across the border, that's one thing, and I think that is going to be difficult. I hope it's not, but I think it will. So, I mean, you know, video, performance, artists coming to make work in the space, things like that, I think we're going to have to be quite clever and figure ways around that. I'm also considering smuggling, which I think might be a possibility as well. How many paintings can you get in the back of a big car, I think, might be an option. In terms of identity, I think it's actually going to focus us more on identity. I think it's becoming, you know, I obviously am very emotional about this issue, as there are many other people here, and I think it'll make us be much more conscious about representing different identities and make sure that we really do fulfill that role, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have another question, either for the panel or for the audience, and it sort of reflects and links to the theme of this conference and the theme of dissent. And on the one hand, you know, reading the various reports that have come out in the last 6 months on Brexit, and according to those reports, the cultural sector very much voted Remain. And it makes me ask the question, if the cultural sector has voted Remain and our visitors, or a good portion of our visitors have voted to leave, how do we get that connection between the cultural sector and our audiences? Is there a disconnect rising between what the cultural sector feels and wants to pursue and what some of our audiences would be more interested in the cultural sector doing? So I don't know whether Brexit forces us to think again about what we are doing as a sector and the nature of the connection with. I don't know if any of you have thoughts on that.
Well, I suppose in relation to that question, I mean, I love that idea of are we alienating a part of society? You know, I mean, it's always something that will drive you forward and want to do more. Yeah, I suppose we are. But, you know, that's the great thing about museums. You're never finished. You're always trying to figure out new ways to develop your service, develop your collections, and look for new audiences. And at the end of the day, it's limited resources, so you do have to target audiences. So there are times where you're targeting a specific audience, and by that very definition, you're alienating another audience. I don't know how you can get away with that. I mean, we want to be facilitators of discussion. We want to be that middle part of the road. You don't want to be one side or the other, which I think is much harder to do than take a side. But at the same time, unless you've got unlimited resources and unlimited buildings, you inevitably do have to go and focus in certain areas if you want to be a success, rather than trying to be all things to all people, because you're never going to please all the people all the time. So I think that's inevitable in museums, but I think, again, Brexit will bring up that option and that issue, and, you know, when it does come up, we can look at it and take it forward from there, I think.
Okay, thank you, Liam. We now have time for the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience, and I sort of have a question I'd like to throw out to you, and you can answer it if you want.
or ask your own questions. But like we were very interested over here in the rise of the idea of a Brexit museum that happened sort of in the last 6 months. The Museum of Sovereignty, the Festival of Britishness, ideas that have come out since the Brexit vote and in the last sort of 6 months. Any of you who run museums in an area that very much voted exit, voted leave, how are you responding? Does this have a consequence for you in your museums? So if you want to answer that question, do. If you want to ask your own question, please put it to any members of the panel. There's a question there, red jumper.
I just wanted to, I'm not going to answer your question, I'm afraid.
Okay, don't worry, you don't have to.
Apart from anything else, I don't work in a museum, I'm a consultant. But my question is, the idea of nuanced borders is a new one for England. It's not something we've ever had to deal with before, and I live in Cambridge, and you can see where the divide is for those communities that voted leave and those that voted remain, either through Facebook, Twitter, and the virtual way in which people are communicating it, and also through flags. The use of flags is something that's come up recently that you've never seen before in a place like Cambridge, which is very much a Remain city. So some of us have been pushing very passionately, and I freely admit I'm very passionate, that Brexit should not happen, and slightly sort of saddened by quite how fatalistically people on the panel were talking about the fact that Brexit is happening and therefore we just need to get on with it. My question is to you and to the audience is, how are museums in the UK challenging the idea of Brexit, whether Brexit will happen, in the same way as Queen's Museum was talking about this morning? If they had a direct response to when Trump came in, how are museums actually responding to it and finding ways that we can push forwards so that Brexit isn't going to happen, that the second vote is a possibility? Because we're doing lots of stuff in our community. I don't do anything with my local museums, but yeah, I'll stop.
I'm totally with you. If only, I hope you could be right. I did, jokingly mention to my colleagues and other colleagues, we should start a campaign called Curators Against Brexit. Should we be actively, as a sector, if we voted Remain, should we be campaigning? Is there a feeling that's the direction we should go in?
Well, we should be campaigning to get Ireland back to the Irish.
I'll just repeat it again, why are we got partition? Why is all these issues coming up for us? Ireland, why can't those who want to leave from Britain leave Europe, but give us back our island? That's all I'd say. I know I'll probably get shot in a distance.
Well, I think the point you've made there is Brexit has raised, it is, for us on this island, there's a lot of old politics, it's not old politics, but long-lived politics, if you like, that can be linked to Brexit and is what raises a lot of feeling and has moved, to people, a lot of action in response to it. So I think your point does resonate with the Brexit debate. Sorry, Liam, and then I saw your hand, so I'll come back.
Just to, I suppose, give an answer, no. I mean, I don't think museums should have any role in that whatsoever. I think Brexit's, unless there's some amazing turnaround, unless Theresa May is playing incredibly close cards to her chest, there's no way Brexit's not going to happen. So I don't know if it's fatalistic or just accepting the reality of it. Eventually you have to. I mean, I personally think it's a terrible idea, but it's happening. So I don't believe museums should be taking sides and advocating one side or the other, because once you do that, then you are one side or the other. You're no longer one of those institutions that people can come and actually discuss. You're no longer a safe space anymore. For me, you're not even a museum anymore, you're an advocacy tool. So no, I don't think we should be getting involved in the debate directly at all. I think we should be reflecting it, but not taking a side.
Thank you, Liam. And there's a question from this lady.
Emily has one up there.
All right,
Hello, I'm Sandra from Historic England. I wanted to pick up on something that the previous session in this room said this morning. I was in the session earlier looking at the decade of commemoration, and one of the speakers was talking about how the principles that have been assigned to that have been about using facts to dispel myth, and that how museums are very well placed to deal in facts and can use those facts to dispel long-held myths. There were many, many myths perpetuated around the whole Brexit conversation. Do museums therefore have a role to use their facts to dispel some of those myths?
I would think so, and I think that's the role of museums, working with the cultural sector, working with the academics, working with campaigners on the ground who are collecting that sort of data that you might be talking about, working with colleagues in writing newspapers. Fintan O'Toole being an example in the Irish Times, who's written really well on Brexit. So yes, I think there is scope post-Brexit to collect the Brexit fever, you know, collect the moment, document it, show the type of myths that arose over our relationship with the EU, and you know, myths and truths, and document and explore it. Definitely there will be that legacy of it. Anybody else want to comment from the panel? I think there was another question. Yes? Yeah.
It was linked to the previous two questions, actually, and your response, Liam. I suppose I feel that, and just having come from the Too Hot to Handle session, which is really interesting just before this, that perhaps there's an opportunity for museums, even if they're not partisan, to allow the conversation, not just allow it, but actively advocate for these burning, burning questions, which is, as we've all been hearing, is going to dramatically affect the way we live and work, especially with our communities, that surely there's a key opportunity for us to grasp that, even if we can't change it, which we may or may not be able to do. But it does feel like there's a bit of a lack there. Potentially, it's such a big issue and it's not really being discussed in our museums. So actually, that wasn't really a question, but what do people think?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm talking about. I don't believe we should be advocating one side or the other, but definitely that's, I suppose, the point I want to really make today. Museums have a great opportunity now. We can step out and really say, look, we can be that space to talk about this. We can be that space to have those really difficult discussions. We have, again, using the collection as a catalyst. That's the key for museums. That's what makes us unique. That's what makes us special. That's what we have to do now. We have to use the opportunity of Brexit, whether we want it or not, to be seen in our own communities as this viable thing, another thing that museums can do. This is somewhere that we're going. We're not just going for the exhibition or the talk. We're going for this talk about something that's happening now. You know, and that might be facilitated discussions, or it might be a reminiscence session using collections. But like that we're talking about Brexit, what does it mean? Because we've already mentioned today, the identity issues are a key thing for the next. I mean, my son's 19. He grew up knowing nothing about the Troubles. He's fairly clear in his identity, he thinks. Not anymore, though. My daughter's 6. She's going to grow up in a very different world, so she's going to have a lot of questions living on the border, especially where we live in Dundalk, which is 2 minutes nearly from the border and you get in the car. So I say now, museums, step forward. This is your chance. Really own that space. You know, like other areas have done, have sort of owned areas. This is an opportunity for us museums to own this. We can say, well, look, if you want to come and discuss this, in our case, come to local authority museums, come to the Northern Ireland Regional Creators Groups, or come to some of our partners in other parts of the UK and talk about this. So I thoroughly agree with you. I just say, but I don't believe we should be taking sides.
Thank you, Liam. And Rianne, you wanted to...
Yeah, I suppose that's really the whole point of this exhibition that we're doing, which opens on the 23rd and 24th of November, so very soon. It's called Crossing Lines because you couldn't call it Brexit, really. And it's not just about Brexit, but it is that idea of, I think particularly contemporary artists are very good at responding to something that's happening around them. I mean, really, we're in the middle of history here, aren't we, as always? And it's very difficult to do an exhibition, a museum exhibition about Brexit, because we're literally, you're too close to it in a sense. Still, we don't know what's happening. But I think, I mean, the image on the invitation is Joy Gerard's Brexit protests from London. So our way of doing that is to engage contemporary artists through performance and through their work, and to really open up that discussion, and also to link it to other protests. I mean, there's so many protests have been happening in Ireland recently with the repeal movement as well. So it's trying to look at that idea of activism as well. So that's really, I suppose, our way of doing it.
Okay, thank you, Rhiannon. And I think we've a question back here. Yes.
This one's on? Indeed it is. Emily from University College Dublin. Just picking up on what you were saying, Elizabeth, about the idea around a museum of Brexit or something like that. I'm just put in mind of the project that John Byrne did, which I think is around 1997, of the Border Interpretative Centre that he set up temporarily on the border and gave it all the kind of accoutrements of a welcome to the border, you know, interpreting the Irish border itself, because this is something that, you know, has never really received direct interpretation or acknowledgement in that way. I think he hired Kevin McAleer to unveil a plaque, you know, for this temporary Border Interpretative Centre. So there's such a long history, I suppose, in terms of the significance and the meaning of the border. And we've been talking quite a lot about initiatives that are reaching out to communities on the island of Ireland itself. But in some ways, it's a little bit kind of continuing that conversation amongst ourselves. Whereas what's happened during the whole debate over Brexit that I think has been very distressing for a lot of people on this island is the lack of knowledge that we see expressed, particularly in the mainstream British media, about the lived conditions of the border itself. And that although, you know, it's going to be needed to continue to have exhibitions exploring identity and the border in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, what we really need to see them is them happening in Britain. So that actual experience that Rhiannon is talking about, that porosity of the border and the enormous changes that the Good Friday Agreement has brought out, that this is really perhaps, there's a level of public understanding which doesn't seem to currently exist in my experience in Britain over what it's actually like, or what it was like to live in Ireland in the 1970s and how vast that change and shift has been. And I think that that's a space of museum work that needs to be done also. So,
Emily, I think that's a very good point, and I think it links very much to what Liam said, that almost, you know, the border museums have a new task to do, and to build on the strength of what they have, to comment on that, and, as you say, reach across the Irish Sea to our neighbours, to really express the impact of Brexit. I think also I feel very strongly that as we reflect back on borders, and certainly that earlier interest in border studies that sort of came up with the Good Friday Agreement, so back in the early 2000s, we have a very different Ireland now to the one of 20 years ago. We're a far more multicultural place. We have a lot of people who weren't born on this island who are now living on this island, and we've first generation families from migrant groups. And we have to think really deeply about the identity issues raised by Brexit for those communities on the island. I have a good colleague who's Turkish who told me last night that on a weekly basis he gets abuse shouted across to him in Belfast. There has been some research on rise of racism and associated with Brexit. So, you know, there's a lot that's really important for us as a cultural sector to think about and to address, and it is a new task for us now, and I'm sure it's keenly felt by all of you in your museums and your cultural places you work. We're now just past 10 past, so unless there's a really burning question, I think we'll have to finish there. But Dash, I have to say a thank you before you dash. But I really would love you all to take a postcard, write a comment before you leave this room, and the volunteers have postcards, and there's more at the front if the volunteers have run out. So please, we really want to gather your thoughts so that we really appreciate what it means across these islands. But just to finish, like Liam said, I'd like to thank the Museums Association for having our panel, and I'd very much like to thank Gina O'Kelly, who of the Irish Museums Association, for proposing. I thought you'd gone, Gina. You moved. So I'd like to thank Gina for proposing this panel, and I'd like to thank her for the work that we've done together over the past year, and the panel members here who've been contributing on a regular basis to that work, and work that is continuing. I mentioned at the beginning our report. I will tweet the link
to the report, and you'll find me on the hashtag Bridge Over Brexit. So I'll tweet the link so that you can all go through and find out what we all together have been thinking about over the last 12 months. And good luck, everybody. Get Brexit ready. Okay.